And I'd like to invite and welcome our two panelists for this next session, who will be furthering our discussion on tree protection. So first, I would like to welcome Jennifer Koskinen, the owner of JK Consulting Arborists. She started her tree adventure with her education in forestry at Lakehead University. From there, she worked in Northern Ontario with the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources at their Centre for Northern Forest Ecosystem Research. After some years enjoying working outside with the bears and wolves, black flies and mosquitoes, she decided to attend Fleming College's Arboriculture program to focus on trees as a single entity. Jennifer has been working in consulting since 2008 throughout Southern Ontario and hasn't stopped since. So welcome, Jennifer. Our second panelist, Daniella Giovanatto, OALA and CSLA, is an ISA certified arborist with over a decade of experience in tree management. As a consulting arborist in the private sector, she has worked on a wide range of projects, including infrastructure construction, improvements, and development, which have resulted in exposure to numerous tree protection bylaws throughout Southern Ontario. Daniella also has experience in municipal review of planning applications and has a background as a landscape architect, giving her a multifaceted perspective to urban forest management. So welcome. Thank you, both of you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. All right. I think, oh, here. To make you co-host. All right, I apologize. Sorry about that. All right, so welcome both of you. Sorry, I didn't realize that I hadn't made you a co-host.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine. Yeah,
Okay.
Thank you. I've had my share of technical difficulties this morning, so I'm crossing my fingers no more for the rest of the day. I think Daniella should have the ability to.
Struggling to turn my camera on because it's underneath one of the buttons and I can't get to the symbol.
Oh.
Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. Thank you.
There we go. Better. Okay.
All right, thanks. Welcome.
Good morning, Daniella. Good morning, Rachel. Good morning, everybody out there.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. And I know we have a pretty short timeline, so I think we'll just hop right into it with questions. I assume you're both doing well today. We really are grateful for you being here and are excited to hear what you have to say. So we just finished with that video from Philip, and he talked about some of the barriers to implementation of tree protection bylaws. And one of the questions that we had put together was, because increasingly municipalities across Ontario are implementing these tree protection bylaws, we wanted to know what you thought were the driving factors in their establishment, in their development, and then maybe you have a different perspective on what some of those barriers to implementation are. So yeah, sorry, I made that a little wordy. So what are the underlying principles driving the establishment of tree protection bylaws? I guess I'll let you begin with that, Jennifer.
I think I was listening to some of Philip's presentation, and I think he covered a lot, covered off all the bases, what he was saying. But really why municipalities want to have protection bylaws, obviously, is to keep trees. And it's a big thing right now to have a large percent canopy cover for climate change and everything, all those discussions going on. So a lot of municipalities where I'm in Southern Ontario already do have bylaws and are constantly updating them. And places that don't have them feel like to help the environment and help increase canopy cover in their area, they believe that's the way to do it. From my perspective, I don't work in municipalities. I haven't worked for a municipality, but that's kind of what I see and understand why they want to have them.
Yeah, certainly. Daniella, do you want to touch on that?
So generally, from my experience, I think just the increased development growth pressures and more recently, the effects of climate change have increased the environmental awareness throughout the community and council and municipal staff to maybe focus more on how to preserve existing trees rather than just planting new ones. because the existing tree can provide more services than a young, newly planted tree. And just, I guess the thing to note, I think Philip touched on it, was that tree protection plans are typically coming through as a requirement of a development process, where the bylaw is something that's a regulation to protect the existing trees. Typically, it can be either private or public scope or both, but that, for the most part, falls outside of the development scope.
Yeah, thanks. No, that makes sense. And Jennifer, you said, we have canopy cover to think of. Daniella, you're saying, climate change is a big thing. We remember that these larger trees are, carrying the bulk of that work in carbon capture. But I also know that, there's a lot of contention sometimes. So my next question is, how do you envision the role of community engagement and participation in shaping and refining these regulations? How do you feel about the level of awareness and compliance among residents and businesses? I guess we can keep that order. Jennifer, do you want to go first?
So I think that number one, when you're sitting at home reading newspaper and you see the city is inviting people to come and give input, a lot of people aren't going to remember to go down or have time or care if it doesn't really apply to them at the time. Until it affects them, then they become interested and understand what's going on. Some people will go and provide input, and municipalities will engage the public at various different types of, whether it's going to be at a farmer's market or an online poll for people to give their input. I think that's one way to get public involved. But again, I don't think that people really become involved until it affects them directly, and then they realize that maybe something that has been put in place isn't exactly what something that they like. So it is difficult, because what I've seen in my community that I live in, when the municipality has tried to revise their bylaws, it seems that they do what they can to try to reach out to people to ask for their input. So you can't force people to give input, but it is very useful for people to give any input that they can, because they have different experiences on something that has happened in their yard with their tree that the city might not have thought about, and that can help revise the bylaw a little bit, or the tree protection, so that people don't get into these conflicted situations with municipalities, and they're kind of stuck with a tree or something and paying a lot of money, that the situation that they don't really like.
So Jennifer had a lot of points that I was hoping to make there.
You can go first next time, Danielle.
No, it's okay. It's totally okay. But one thing I do want to add is that there, like you were saying about revision to a bylaw or the creation of a new bylaw, typically there's more awareness around that time when it's happening, because the municipality is seeking out. But I think in between, when a bylaw has been in place for some time, it's not really at the forefront of current conversation or media coverage. So it kind of gets forgotten until, like Jennifer was saying, it directly impacts a person in something they want to do, or their plans. So I think it's pretty easy for the average citizen to not be aware of one, that even a bylaw exists, unless it's directly impacted them. Or if it's being reported through media coverage, if let's say there's a big penalty, I know this happens a lot in Toronto, where like a developer has cut down a certain amount of trees, that typically makes the news, but a neighbor cutting down one tree isn't generally going to, right?
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, no, I think that's something that that has been, circulating a lot in conversation, is that there's a different element of having one tree cut down, which maybe means a lot to one of the neighbors, and they're really upset that like that tree is gone. But then there's also that dynamic where you have whole sections of forest and woodlot being taken down in development areas. So I think that is a really interesting dynamic to play into. I have someone has their hand up. which I'd be willing to allow them to talk if both of you are open to that.
Sure.
Okay, here, we'll see. Cool. All right, Erin, if you had your, oh, I think it was there. Kat, you had your hand up. Sorry. Okay, Kat, if you have a question that you'd like to ask to our panelists, you can do that now. Oh, okay. Sorry, that was an accident then. Okay, my bad. All right, so we'll move on to our next question. So speaking of development, how do you anticipate balancing the need for development and growth with the imperative to preserve and protect our urban and peri-urban forests?
Daniella, you can go
yeah,
ahead.
Daniella, you can go first on this one.
Switch it up. I think in this present political climate, housing and development mandates are like a prevalent agenda item, and it's a very challenging task. Alluding back to some of Philip's presentation, where the development process is a completely different beast than a bylaw, right? So there's a lot of competing interests. The other thing that often gets overlooked is increased housing targets and densities often require a lot of infrastructure, which exceeds the footprint of the actual project site. So with increased densities, more housing, you need a lot of other infrastructure like transportation, parking, utilities, servicing upgrades, other community infrastructure to support all that population growth. So it really is on a bigger scale. And that, I guess what I'm trying to say is, at a municipal level, a big picture strategy really needs to be in place to consider the grand scheme. This is typically done through an urban forest management plan. And in that case, then your tree protection bylaws or policies can become tools to reach your goals that have been set out in this plan. But overall, I think it's a very challenging task to meet the needs of everyone. There's so many competing interests.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. Jennifer?
Yeah, I work with a lot of new development projects and developer clients, and I hope none of them are listening right now. But the problem that I see with trying to keep trees, and I believe Philip covered it off in his presentation also, is that, you know, there's guidelines to try to keep trees, existing ones, and you go through all the work of going through the studies and writing the reports, and then you're essentially able to cut down trees anyway. So it's just checking a box and going through this process, and then, okay, we did that, so now we can cut all the trees down. The number of trees being removed in development definitely outweighs the people that I'm helping cut single trees down on their private property for constructing a pool, or because the tree is dropping a lot of branches or whatever. So I think like a pre-consultation with municipalities per site is something that we can't stop development. Population is increasing, and we need to have places for people to live. And that needs to be understood, but we also need to understand that we need to try to find how to keep trees within those spaces. So I think that my experience, it would have to be a per site, per project basis with a general guideline and policy guiding that, and then a strict enforcement around that, where, you know, this is what you're allowed to do on this site. This is what the areas that you have to keep, and however they can maintain that in the future, but something along that line anyway.
Yeah, I suppose like what comes to my mind is the idea of having something planted in especially for our urban areas, having something that's planted in a place where it's maybe the right tree in the wrong place, or wrong tree in the right place, and where we might encounter these issues where people, you know, they're like this tree is either a hazard for falling or that sort of thing. And something that was going to be touched on in Daniella's presentation this morning, which unfortunately has been postponed, is maybe the move to be more carefully, to consider more what trees we're putting in certain places. So I wondered if either of you have any experience, like working in a situation where, you know, you're forced to make either a decision or something like that relating to trees that you maybe want to keep, but are just like not, you know, aren't fitting in the space where they're in.
Yeah, definitely that happens all the time, especially through development review. And again, there's increasing pressures from different departments. There's things that need to go into the site. Everyone needs to get their needs met. And unfortunately, sometimes it just comes down to the tree has to go, whether it's a good quality tree or not. And in that scenario, what I think a bylaw can help achieve is having a requirement for replanting or compensation plants to offset. It's never going to equate to the same thing of what was removed, but at least it provides something that's a method to put some trees back, and that's an important part of the bylaw tool. I don't know if you have anything to add there, Jen.
No, yeah, I definitely agree that that are really nice a lot for infrastructure, or just a slight widening to meet the city needs to have the sidewalk a certain width. So when we're replacing the sidewalk, we have to replace the smaller sidewalk that was there centuries ago with the new standard. And just because we have a new standard, there goes the nice row of trees beside it. So it's a little bit silly, but it does happen. And if that's the way that we have to follow things, then yes, planting, we have to just make sure that planting matches the removals, and focus a lot on making sure those trees can grow back.
And just to sort of add on, just I think the most important thing is that across the municipality, all different departments, interested parties, and decision makers need to be aligned with a common goal in order to have an effective urban forest policy or vision or strategy, because otherwise what's happening, it's all being done on a site by site basis, and you end up with no trees in your downtown core and all your trees in kind of the areas where there's more room.
Yeah, definitely. And then we get into the, you know, the discussion about tree equity and making sure that there are those spaces for trees, right? We have some questions popping up in the Q&A, so I might direct my attention there for a minute. So in terms of tree replacement, Joseph asks, is there strong cases or examples of returning on site to review if trees are replaced? Do many municipalities enforce this?
So typically, typically that would be part of a development agreement. That compensation forms part of that. And depends on what type of development it is, what process it's going through, but there are checks to make sure that those trees are provided, at least in the short term. Whether they survive, typically it's a 1 to 2 year follow-up check after the final landscape is done. But long-term checks, no, there's not a lot of those happening. So if the trees aren't surviving past kind of that 2 year stage, which is typical for a warranty period, there's not really much that's happening to make sure that these trees are surviving.
Right. Yeah. And someone commented in the chat, 40% of removed trees don't get replanted, like quoted from an ASCA conference in 2018. So I think that's also something that is on people's minds, like about considering tree replacement. Yeah, did you want to touch on that, Jennifer?
No, just that definitely that sounds about right without doing any check on that fact.
Yeah.
It sounds about right from my experience where, you know, you're working in an area where you're removing large canopy trees, then you're replacing it with small trees because that's just how it goes. And then are those trees going to be able to meet at some point ever to replace that canopy cover, whether it's so many years down the road. And then as far as private tree bylaws go, when a homeowner's removing a tree on their property and they're paying a municipality a compensation fee, where that's some situations where you have to pay a certain amount of money to the municipality just for removing the tree, the value of the tree. Where is that money going to? And is that fully being used towards replacing trees. So transparency with that, I think, is important for people to see that, you know, that is being matched. The removals and the money going into the city for all the tree compensation, permitting, and fees is actually being planted or being used for tree growth.
Yeah, no, that's a key point, I think, for sure. Brendan asks, is there or are either of you aware of a jurisdiction in Ontario with a particularly strong model for bylaw enforcement, and what are their strengths, if something comes to mind?
Yeah, I think my experience is definitely the bigger cities where, so I'm in Southern Ontario, and the bigger cities like Toronto and Oakville are known to be places where a lot of residents are very highly aware of the tree bylaws and what people are allowed to do, and are constantly calling on construction projects or their neighbors, and letting the cities know. So it's the people that live in the community that are well aware of the bylaws, and they are letting the city know what's going on, so that it can be enforced, or any type of enforcement can happen. And also certain cities such as Toronto, they have a large staff to go out and review each site. So I've worked on projects where city staff will go out and basically check my work and make sure that I am giving the right information. And then when the trees are removed or the trees are planted or whatever, that it's done in the right order, that we actually have our permit first before we remove the tree. So some cities do have the strength behind them to do that, but a lot of municipalities don't have the numbers for the people to go out and actually do these checks. But I would say Toronto so far would be something that I've had experience with, that follows through with their enforcement.
Yeah, Daniela, do you have experience,
Yeah, so the same sort of thing. The bigger the municipality, the more resources they have to enforce these bylaws. So these small municipalities, they may have a bylaw, they may not, but enforcement is always an issue. And that's one of the biggest reasons not to enact a tree bylaw, because if you, like Philip had mentioned, if you can't enforce it, why bother? So a lot of these smaller municipalities in Southern Ontario, they don't have a dedicated urban forestry department or staff that can oversee the enforcement of bylaws. And where they do have an enforcement department, those people aren't trained. They're not arborists. They have no idea or the proper background. It's not they have no idea. They just don't have the proper background to properly enforce the bylaw.
Yeah, no, I can completely understand that. I'm like coming from a pretty small, like I don't live in London. I'm just south of London, and I have those experiences where I see things in the city that I'm learning about, like the trees that are being cut down in certain places, and that's something that I want, like I'm actively wondering like whether that is something that our municipality has the capacity to to focus on. So there's another question about I'll read it. Philip mentioned bylaws in which trees are on private property being hard to enforce. Is there more proactive enforcement of bylaws when trees are on city property? And this is someone who's living in the US. They're wondering like who's responsible to enforce that.
I would go back on what I just said, and you have to have the staff to enforce it. Not only do you have to have the staff, but you have to have documented evidence. So generally, again, with the smaller municipalities, there is no appetite to proceed down a legal avenue, right? So if trees are removed. Jen, I don't know if you have any experience with that.
No, I have seen and have heard of people removing trees on city property, and either the city doesn't find out about it. So it's just the matter of whether someone actually notices that the tree's gone. So usually it'll be a tree that's significant that people drive by a lot that would actually notice that the tree's gone. Some people and tree companies remove trees in people's yards, and they aren't aware that there's a bylaw, and it's only until someone happens to tell them or they get caught. And there has been cases that I've known that people have had to go to court. The tree company had to go to court because they removed a tree in someone's backyard without getting a permit. So it does happen, but it also happens the other way, where you remove a tree in your yard and you have no idea there's a bylaw. You might get away with it without even realizing you're getting away with anything.
Yeah, no, for sure. There's a question about if there's any good strategies for accounting to tree preservation prior to development. So this comment says, trees are usually removed before the grading stage and to help with municipal grading requirements. So what sort of, like, in those more developmental type areas, as opposed to the residential, can you think of like anything that's already in place or any good strategies for accounting to tree preservation?
So in my opinion, the best strategy is early identification of tree preservation, because once you have a site plan or development in mind, and you're trying to fit it to the site, which is how most developments go, really the trees are just an afterthought. Jen, I think you have some direct experience with this.
Well, I'm not sure where this person is from, but where Brendan's from, but it sounds like he's saying that grading is happening and they just remove the tree. So what the process that we use is that the municipalities require prior to construction that before any mobilization happens for construction, there's a huge planning process where you need to go on site and have a tree inventory done. The trees are mapped out. You identify which ones can be kept, and if any trees are located by any of the construction and you just can't keep them at all, then those are the ones that are removed. And then when construction starts, the tree protection fence goes around the trees that you can keep, and the trees that are removed are within the construction area are taken out. So that's generally how it works to keep trees before the grading process happens.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. And I think that, again, I think I spoke to both of you about it. Like we have, just north of St. Thomas, south of London, a big Volkswagen battery plant is going in. Yeah, it's been something where there's a lot of grading going on. There's a lot of trees coming down. So I definitely think that's something on my mind, at least. We've reached the end of our time slot, and there's still questions coming in. So I invite our attendees to engage in that discussion in the chat and throughout the Q&A. But I want to thank you, Jennifer and Daniella, for being here to kind of continue on this discussion. I know it's something that we could talk about probably all day, as there's a lot of nuance to it, a lot of different regulations in a lot of different places. So we appreciate your insight and yeah, certainly appreciate your knowledge that you're able to bring to this short panel today.
It was short. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, I know. Yeah,
there's so much to
for
talk
being
about.
here.
There's so much to get into that we just like skim the surface. There's a lot. Yeah, there's a lot more to it than that, but that's just a little bit so far. Maybe we can talk more another time.
Yeah, absolutely. If you have a chance and want to, just address some of those comments in the chat, or we can always touch base at a different time. I can collect questions and send them your way or something like that to continue this. But yeah, unfortunately, that's all the time we have today.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks, Rachel.
Yeah, thank you, Daniella. Thanks, Jennifer.